But when we hover over the different values, you'll see that our custom tooltip is now displaying, and it has replaced the default tooltip that was already displayed within this line chart. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you everything you need to know about building line charts in Bubble. Using the Chart.JS plugin by Techblocks, I'm going to be taking the time to explain how you can create any different type of line chart to visualize and display any static or dynamic data you might have stored within your database. Whether you're new to using Bubble or you're an experienced no-code developer, this tutorial will help you take your line charts to the next level. Within our video today, I'll be explaining the step-by-step instructions to creating both single and multi-series line charts. And these can be from a static data source that you manually add or a dynamic data source that you can pull from your database. From there, I'll also be explaining how you can create stepped line charts as well as area charts, as well as explaining how you can create your own custom tooltips for your charts, custom labels to help indicate what data is being displayed in those charts, and then finally the ability to create events when a user either hovers or clicks on a chart itself. There's plenty of content that I want to cover throughout this tutorial, so let's just jump right into our Bubble editor and get started. So today I'm going to be running you through the process of creating a series of different line charts using the Chart.JS plugin within Bubble. And before I jump into my editor and show you how to build the charts, I just wanted to explain a personal preference that I like to include throughout any building process. And that is that I like to create a Notion doc with a checklist of all the different items that I'll be including throughout the build. In this case today, I've added in a list of all the different types of line charts that I'll be including throughout our tutorial. And as we move along throughout the tutorial, I'll be coming back and just checking these off so we can keep a tab on where we are throughout the video. The first chart I will be creating though today is just a static multi-series line chart. And what I mean by static is that this line chart will have a manual data source. So we won't be linking it to data stored in our database or an external API. Instead, we'll be manually adding in some values that we would like to display ourselves. And this can be quite useful if you're creating things like a marketing landing page where you'd like to include an infographic or perhaps some fixed data on a chart. So let's jump over into our Bubble editor and we can get started. Over in my editor, I've just created a blank canvas page here, and the first thing I'll need to do is install the Chart.JS plugin to make sure I can create the best chart possible. So I'll be jumping over into my plugins tab here, and I already have the plugin installed, but if you do not at this point, you'll need to open up the plugin library and search for the Chart.JS plugin. And this is a plugin created by Techblocks. And what I love about this plugin is that you'll see there's a link here that sends you through to a Bubble editor with plenty of examples of all the different styles of charts that you can create, whether it be bar charts, line charts, or scatter charts. And what I also love is that they have a rich repository of documentation here for any different style of chart you'd like to create, as well as any different key features you would like to create within those charts. And if I move my head out of the way here, you can see that you can access the link to any editor within their documentation pages. So that way you can open up any of the charts and see how they're created on the back end. But if I jump back into Bubble, I'll show you how we can get started creating our first chart. So once I've installed the Chart.JS plugin, I can jump into my design tab. I will scroll on down to my visual elements here, and I can now see that I have a list of different charts that I can add in. But before I add the chart in, I just like to add a group as a container on the page, just so I can create a custom color background for this chart. And I'll be updating the default style of this group to be the group border option, just so it has a white background. And now I can head over to our visual elements and select to add in a bar/line chart. I will drag this out within our group. I can also center that horizontally and center that vertically within the group. And what you'll see now is that you have complete control to customize this chart in whatever type of style or formatting you would like. At the moment, it's currently set to a default chart type of a bar chart, but we can easily update this to be a line chart. And then while I'm here, I'd also like to update where my legend is displayed on our chart and choose to display this at the bottom. Now, if I was to select to preview this editor page, you'll already see that there are some static values stored by default in this chart. So it can help give you a good idea of how the styling of this chart is already added within your bubble editor. But of course, as I mentioned, we can customize this in whatever way we'd like. So if we jump back into our editor here, we'll start by updating the X values within this chart. So at the moment, this chart is filtering values throughout the X series as a list of days. But what I'd like to do in our example today is display a list of sales revenue for different products, and then filter those values by the years that that revenue belongs to. So for our X value here, I'm going to choose to add in a list of static options of years. So I'll start by just deleting the current static values, and I'll add in the years 2018. One thing I will just note is that you'll need to separate any static values with a comma, as it mentions above the input here. Then I can add in my next year, 2019, 2020, and also 2021. And now that we've added in our X values, we can scroll on down to the bottom of our element inspector here, and you'll see that we have an option to add in a series of Y values now. And again, we'll have complete control over the data that's displayed within our Y values here. So I can start by updating the name of each entry. I'll be calling this one product A. And then I could also update the name of the entry 2 to be called product B. And then the third series I can update to be called product C. And now, as I mentioned before, you will see that there is a list of static options already predefined within this field. I'm happy to actually keep the values of these. But one thing I will note is that you'll see that there is 5 static options here, whereas in my X values, I was only storing 4 years. So what I will need to do is just remove the last option, because each of these values will align with a value of a year. So 120 will be linked to 2018 because that's the first static entry in our X value. Then 260 will be the year 2019, 240 will be 2020, and so on. So once I'm happy with those 4 values, I can then scroll on down to product B. I will then need to do the same, so I will just remove the last static value. And then for product C, what I'll need to do is add in my own values because there's currently just not any default values within this field. So I'm just going to go and add in some custom values. I'll start with 250, 320, 170, and then 380. And by all means, you can add in whatever custom values you would like, depending on what data you would like to display. And now once I've added in those static values, we can preview our editor once again. And you'll now see that it's added in a list of 3 different products. And it's displaying the static values that we added across our X and Y series. And what you'll notice is that the current tooltip is also displaying on our line when we hover it. So it's showing the year that we're currently viewing and then the revenue for that product. But at the moment, this chart's looking fairly basic. So what I'd also like to do is just show you how you can customize any particular field within this chart to just make it a bit more visually enticing for your end users. So if we jump back into Bubble, the first thing I would like to edit is just the color that's displayed for product B. So at the moment, it's just a light shade of gray, which is a little difficult to see on our white background. So what I'd like to do is just update this to be a purple color. And then the next field I'd like to change is the font of the legend that was displayed in our chart. So this was just the text at the bottom of our chart there. And because this element is like any other bubble element, you can completely customize this with your own styles. So I'm going to update the font size to be 16. I will also update the font itself to be Poppins 500. And now if I was to refresh the page once again, you can just see that the color of our product B has been updated. And also the fonts for our legend have also been updated as well. But one other field that I would like to change, and this is probably one of my favorite features within the Chart.JS plugin, is the ability to change the custom tooltip that is displayed when a value is hovered on our chart. So at the moment it has a default value here, which as I mentioned is just displaying the year as well as the revenue for that product. But this default tooltip looks a little basic. So what we can do is create our own custom tooltip and style it however we would like. And as I mentioned, in my opinion, this is probably one of the most powerful features within the Chart.JS plugin. And let me jump back into my bubble editor and show you why. So the Chart.JS plugin allows you to create your own custom tooltip using a group element. So if you're to create a group next to your chart, you can display any information you'd like that is shown to a user whenever they hover or click on any value within the chart. And when I say you can add in anything to that group, I really do mean anything. You can display dynamic values that correspond to the chart, or you can even display dynamic values that you have stored within your database. Let me show you how we can create a custom experience by adding in a group element to our page. I'll be updating the default style of this to be group border once again, and I'll be calling this group tooltip 1. And now within this group, what I'd like to do is just create an enriched version of the current tooltip that was being displayed in our line chart here. And so the first thing I'd like to do is just display a color icon of the current product that's being hovered in our chart. So in order to do that, I'm going to add in another group into our existing group here. And for this group, I'm going to remove the style of this. And I'd like the color of this group to change dynamically based on the color of the product that's being hovered by the user. And so for the background style of this group, what I can do is select to choose from a flat color. And instead of just adding in a static color here, what I can do is remove the current option, choose to insert dynamic data, and then I can choose from our line chart element that we have on our page. And then what I'd like to do is select from the hovered item series color. So if you remember, the product series was the 3 products that I had stored. So product A, B, and C. And of course, for each product, we also had a unique color that would allow us to identify them within the chart. So if I select that the color should be the hovered item series color, this group will update dynamically based on which product we're hovering over. And I'll show you how that works in a moment. But while I'm here, I'd also just like to update the roundness of this group to be 100, so it's a perfect circle. And now beside our circle group here, what I'd like to do is display the year that the current person is hovering over. So if they're hovering over a product in 2019, I would like to display that the year is 2019. And the way I can do this is just by adding in a text element into our group here. I will just increase the size of that so we can actually see the text. And then I will choose to insert dynamic data. And once again, I'll be selecting from our line chart that we've added on our page. And in this case, what I'd like to do, as I mentioned, is display the year that's currently being hovered. And if you remember, we had stored the year as our X value. So I'll be selecting to display the hovered X value, which will be 2018, 2019, or 2020, depending on what year is currently being hovered. And now once I'm displaying the year, what I'd like to do is open up our rich text editor. And because this is like any other element within Bubble, you can format the styling of this group however you would like. And in this case, I'm going to highlight this text and choose to bolden that. I'll then save that. And now below the year value that we're displaying, what I'd like to do is display the name of the product that the user is hovering, as well as the revenue that it generated for that particular year. And so the way I'll be doing that again is by grabbing yet another text element. I'll be dragging this below our circle group that we've added in here. And as I mentioned, the first thing I'd like to do is display the name of the product that's being hovered. So that'll be product A, B, or C. So I can choose to insert dynamic data here. And once again, I'll be choosing from our line chart. And in this case, it will be the hovered item series name. Because of course, the series itself was the different values we had stored in our y-axis. So I'll be selecting that option. And now what I'd like to do is display the revenue for that product by that year. So I'll be adding in a semicolon, I'll add in a space, and then I would like to insert dynamic data. And once again, I'll be selecting from our line chart. And in this case, I would like to display the hovered item Y value. So although the series name was displaying the actual name of the product, the Y value will be the revenue that we have stored for that product. So I'll select to add the hovered item Y value. And because this is like any other text element with bubble, I can also choose to format this. And in this case, I would like to format this as a currency, which means I can add in our thousand separator and also choose the style of currency that I would like to display. I can then close that. And in this case, what I'd like to do with the formatting is just open up our rich text editor and just select from our semicolon forwards and then choose to bolden that particular text. So that will be the year that we're actually displaying to the user. I can then select to save that. And then before we preview this tooltip, I'm just going to make sure that all of the elements in my group line up here. I can then also close off the height and width of our tooltip here, just so there's not any empty space. And now what I will also need to do is show you how we can integrate this custom tooltip with the chart here. So at the moment, we've just created a group that's sitting on our page like any other element. But what we'll need to do is assign a HTML ID attribute to this group and then link that to the chart itself. And this is actually a pretty straightforward process to do. I can explain every step along the process for you. But what you'll need to do first within your bubble editor is actually allow your editor to assign ID attributes to elements. So if you jump over to your settings option here, head into the general tab, and then scroll on down, you'll see an option right above where you install your Google Maps API keys. And this option will display the text, expose the option to add an ID attribute to HTML elements. What you'll need to do is just tick that should be enabled. And then if you jump back into your design tab, you'll see at the bottom of every element a field here that allows you to manually assign a HTML ID attribute. And so what we'll be doing is assigning the attribute for this group to be called tooltip1. And then I will highlight this text, jump over into my line chart that I've added, and you'll see the second input field here allows you to integrate a custom tooltip ID. So all you'll need to do here is just paste in that ID attribute. And now what will happen is that this group on our page will be hidden, and it will only display when it's required as you hover over the different values in your line chart. So let's jump over and preview our editor once again. And now on this page, you'll notice that the group that we've added is currently hidden. But when we hover over the different values, you'll see that our custom tooltip is now displaying, and it has replaced the default tooltip that was already displayed within this line chart. And of course, as I hover over different values, you'll see that the color of that tooltip will automatically update to display the relevant product, the year that we're currently viewing this product for, and of course, the product's revenue that it had generated throughout that particular timeline. Now, if we jump back over into our Notion doc, we're going to check off that we've finished adding in our first chart today, which was the static multi-series line chart. Throughout this process, I did also just explain how you could create your own custom tooltips, which, as I mentioned, is by far one of the most powerful features for the Chart.JS plugin that really separates it from any other plugins you'll find within the Bubble plugin library. But now that we have some experience adding in a static chart, what I'd like to do is now explain how we can integrate the data stored within our database to display on a line chart within our application. Let's jump back into our Bubble editor and I'll explain this process in more detail. So back in my Bubble editor here, I'm just going to expand my page down, and then I will choose to add another group element into my page. So I'll be dragging a small group out here. And like before, I'll be updating the style of this to be called group border. And then I'll be adding in another line bar chart here. And for this particular chart, what I would like to do is display some dynamic data that I have stored within my database. So similar to my example before where I was displaying product revenue by the year, I have some data stored within my database here that is also storing a similar value. So I have a data type here called sales by year. And within this data type, I just have 3 different data fields. There's the product name, there's the revenue it generated, and then there's the year that that revenue was accrued within. And then if I open up my app data tab here, select to open my sales by year data type and just zoom on in, you'll see that I have a list of different entries for every single product for every single year. So you can see product A has revenue for 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. And then you'll see that I've also added in some data for product B throughout those years, as well as product C. And so of course that just means that I can reference and display this data at any given point within our line chart. So if I jump back into my design tab, I'll just zoom back on out there. The first thing I'm going to do is actually just update the name of this chart. I'll be calling this chart line dynamic single. And the reason I say single is because in this case, I'd like to show you how to build a dynamic single line bar chart. So in my example before, I had shown you how to create a multi-series line chart. So this is a line chart where there are multiple values being displayed, but instead of displaying the revenue for every single product by its year, what I'd like to do is just aggregate all of these products' revenues together for each year, and then just display that on one single line. So if I jump back into Bubble here, what I'll need to do is first update the chart type to be a line chart. And of course, like before, I'll be showing my legend at the bottom of the chart. And now for our X values, what I'll need to do is display all of the years that I have stored within my database. So that, of course, again, will be 2018, 2019, and so on. So I'll just delete the current default static value there. And now I can select to insert dynamic data. And of course, from here, I can reference any values in my database. So I'll be selecting the do a search for option. The type of data I'll be searching through is my sales by year. And what I'd like to do is sort the years. So I'll be selecting the year option by the descending value to be no. So that way they'll just be in chronological order. Now within my database, if you remember, I was storing 4 values of years for 3 different products, which just means that, let's say for the year 2018, I had 3 different entries in my database that shared the same value. So if I just jump back into my data tab, let me just explain this in more detail. So for product A here, it has a value for 2018. Product B also had a value for 2018, and product C had a value for 2018, meaning there were 3 different entries of 2018. So if I was to just display the years as they currently are within my database, I would find that there'd be 3 different values of 2018 across my x-axis. And that's actually not the experience I want to create. I only want to display 1 entry of 2018, and then of course the value of all the products where the revenue was also in that year. So what I'll need to do in my design tab is group the years that I've just searched for and only display 1 unique instance of 2018. And the way I can do this is by just searching for the grouped by filter here. And this will now allow me to group all the years that share the same values together. So I'll be selecting that the field I should be grouping is the years, and then the type of grouping will be exact. So whenever a year in my database has the exact same value as another, it will just group that into one value. And then after I've grouped all those years together, I'll just need to determine what type of text I would like to actually display. And that of course will be the year itself. So if the year is 2018, I want it to display the text 2018. And so the way I'll do that is just by selecting from our year data field here, and that will now display it on my x-axis. And once I've configured the value of my x-axis, I will need to configure the dynamic value of my y-axis. So if I scroll on down to our y series here, what I'll need to do first is actually just delete these static values here. And because I'm only going to be displaying a single line, I'll just need to make sure I'm only storing a value in one field. So by removing the default static values in our Series 2 option here, it will no longer display a second value. And then for our Series 1 option here, I'm going to update the name of this to be called All Products, because I'll be displaying the revenue for all products by their year. And then of course, I will also be removing the static options there. I'll be inserting dynamic data. And in this case, I'll be once again searching for all of the sales within my database. And then similar to before, what I'll need to do is actually group these by the year that that data is stored for. So I'll once again be selecting the group by option. And similar to before, I'm going to create the exact same grouping. So the field that I'll be grouping here is the year, and the type of grouping will be the exact option once again. So that way I'm grouping all the revenues for each year into one specific entry. And then from here, what I'll need to do is also create an aggregation. And an aggregation just allows us to identify what particular data it is that we would like to display for this grouping. And in this case, this will be the revenue itself. So what I'd like to do is calculate the sum, so the total of all of the revenue. And now it will identify all of the revenue for each individual year. And then once I've created this grouping, I'll just need to display the actual sum of revenue itself. So that's the calculation that we performed. And that's all we'll need to add for this particular dynamic value. Let's jump into our Bubble application and take a preview of what this now looks like. So if I scroll on down on my page here, you can now see that I pulled all the data from our database and it's aggregating those into the yearly values on a nice single line bar chart here. Now for this bar chart, I'm not going to create my own custom tooltip, but what I would like to do is just quickly explain how you can add your own custom data labels to this chart if you'd like. And a data label is just a value that can display over the top of every entry within this line chart without you having to actually hover over it to inspect the value itself. So if we just jump back into Bubble, I'm going to show you how you can quickly style this particular line chart. So if I scroll on up to the top, the first thing you'll notice is that you can update the animation duration of this chart when the page is loaded. I'm happy to just keep that as it is. But if I keep scrolling down, you'll see that you'll have some options to also update the background of the chart. So if you want to update the style of the grid lines that are displayed, once again, I am happy to just keep those as standard right now. But what I'm interested in showing you is how you can update the data labels. So by default, these data labels are turned off. What I'd like to do is switch this value over to yes. And now the data that we'll be displaying within each label is the revenue by the year. So it'll be the Y series value that you've stored within this chart. And because we're storing the revenue of products in aggregate for a year, what I'd like to do is add a unit before the label. So in this case, it will just be a dollar symbol. If you are adding a percentage, what you could do is add the unit after the label and add the percentage prefix. And if you'd really like, what you can also do is customize the background of the label. I'm happy to just keep that as it is. But what I would like to do is just customize the font color of this label. And I just like this to be a similar blue to the current color that's being displayed on the line itself. And of course, you can also update the font size of that data label. But while we're here, I'm also just going to update the width of our line chart. So at the moment, the line width is 3. I can update that to 5 just to make the lines a little thicker. And then I'm also happy to just keep the rest of the settings standard there. But now that we've added some small customizations to this chart, let's take another preview into our Bubble editor here. And you'll now see in our chart that not only has the line become a little thicker, but you'll also see that the data labels are displaying the values on our chart without having to actually hover over it to display the tooltip. One thing I can see though is that this data label is a bit out of sight there just because the group is a little short. But a quick fix that we can add to expand the total height of this chart is by just jumping back into our Bubble editor. And what we can do is just scroll on up to the top and there'll be an option here where we can update the chart padding. At the moment it's currently set to 10. I'm going to update that to be 15. I'll then just preview my editor again. And if I scroll back down to the line chart, you'll see that it's just added some additional padding around that chart. So now you can see the value of that data label. I'm going to jump back into Notion now and just check off that we've finished adding in our first dynamic chart, which was the dynamic single line chart. And while we were adding that chart, I also explained how we could add in our own custom data labels, which of course is a way to display the values of data without having to hover over it with our tooltip. But the next chart I would like to show you how to create is a dynamic multi-series line chart. So essentially, I'm just going to replicate the multi-series chart that we had initially added here. Only instead of displaying a list of static options for product revenue, I'm going to display a list of dynamic data that we have stored for product revenue in our database. And so if we jump back into our bubble editor, what I'd like to do is add another group element onto our page beside our existing dynamic single line chart here. I'll once again be updating the group style to be group border, and then I'll be adding in a bar/line chart. I will quickly just center that horizontally and also center that vertically. And while I'm here, I'll be updating the name of this to be called chart, line, dynamic, multi. And of course, I'll need to update the chart type from the default bar chart option to be a line chart. I'll be showing my legend at the bottom. And now when I'm adding in my x-axis, this will be the exact same process of when we added in the dynamic x-axis for our single line bar chart here. So once again, what I'd like to do is group all of the years together in our database. Only instead of displaying just a single value for the product revenue for that particular year, I'd like to display a series of all of the different product values for that particular year. So I'll be jumping into Bubble, and like before, I'm going to just delete the static options that have been added in our X values. I'll be inserting dynamic data. I'll be performing a search through our database for all of these sales, and I'll be sorting these by their year with the descending value to be no, meaning they'll be in chronological order. And then what I'll need to do is just group all of these years together to define only the unique values. So I'll create a new grouping, and I'll be grouping these by the years, and I'll be setting the type of grouping to be exact, so that way we're only displaying one particular year for all of the entries. And then the text itself that I'll be displaying is the name of that year. I apologize if I ran through that a little quickly, but that's the exact same process that we had added for our previous dynamic chart. But what I'm interested in showing you in more detail is how we can now scroll on down to our Y series values and display the dynamic revenue that we've stored for each individual product within our database. So instead of just adding in one dynamic value on our Y series, what I'd like to do is add in 3 different values. There'll be product A, product B, and product C. So I'm going to start by updating the name of the series. So series 1 will be called product A, series 2 will be product B, and then finally series 3 will be called product C. And now in order to display these values, I'll once again just be removing the static options. And I would like to insert dynamic data in our database, and I'll be once again performing a search through all of the sales data that I have stored. Only this time I'm going to be adding in a constraint to only display the sales data for product A. So I'll only want the sales data to be displayed when the product name equals, and then I can just remove the dynamic option there and add in my own manual value, which will be called product A. And of course, this is the exact same value that I had stored for product A in my database. So one thing I will just note is that you'll need to type out this value with the exact same capitalization that you have stored within your database, because essentially this is just going to be searching for all of the product A's within your database, and then we can group all of those values together. So after I've performed a search for all of the product A sales in my database, the next step will follow much the same process as our single line chart before. So I'm going to need to then select the group by option, and I would like to group the revenue of product A by all of its different years. So I'll be selecting the year option, I will be identifying the exact value, and then the aggregate number that I'll actually be displaying is of course the sum of that revenue once again. So I'll be selecting to calculate the sum, which is the total of revenue, and then finally I will be displaying the actual sum of that revenue. And then what we'll need to do for product B is the exact same process. So I'm just going to delete the static options here. I'll insert dynamic data. I will then be performing a search through our database for all of the sales data, only this time identifying when the product name equals I will remove the dynamic option and type in product B, making sure that the capitalization matches the same value that's stored in my database. And then I will be grouping these by the year. So I'll be typing in the word group by. I can select a new grouping, and I will group this into the year, making sure I'm matching all of the exact same values of our years together. And then for the aggregation, which is the data I'm displaying, I would like to find the sum, which is the total of all of the revenue. And then of course, I would like to display that sum of revenue. And now for product C, it'll be the exact same, but of course you'll just be updating the product that you're searching for in your database to also be product C. To save us the time though, I'm just going to jump ahead and add that in now, and then we can continue on from that point in our tutorial. Okay, so I've just jumped ahead and added in the revenue for product C. I've also just taken a bit of time to update some of the styling features of this chart. So let's now jump over into our bubble development environment and take a bit of a preview of what this new chart looks like. If I scroll on down on this page, you can see I have my multi-series line chart here, only this time it is pulling through the dynamic values of the product sales I have stored in my database. And of course, if you really wanted, you could create your own custom tooltip as well. You could pretty much just duplicate the existing tooltip that we've created for the static line chart. But after we've finished adding our dynamic multi-series chart in, I'm just going to open up my Notion doc here and check off that I've finished adding in that particular style of line chart. And then while I'm here, what I'd also like to do is just show you how we can store values when charts are not only just hovered, but also clicked. And I have a good example of what this looks like within a separate editor here. So within this chart, I have the exact same dynamic multi-series line chart that I've just added in. But you'll see in the group here, I'm going to be storing a value every time I not only hover a value, but also click on a point in our chart. So if I start hovering over a chart, you'll see that it will display the dynamic value of the particular product that I'm viewing. But if I decide to then click on that value, we can also store that here. And then when I hover over another value, I can compare that to the point that we had clicked. And this is actually pretty straightforward to do with the Chart.JS plugin. If I jump back into the original bubble editor here, what I'm going to do is recreate that exact same process with the dynamic multi-series chart that we've just added. So I'm going to move this group down on our page here. And what I'd like to do is just expand this group out to the right-hand side. And then within this group, I'll be adding another group element. I'll drag this out. I will just remove the style of this because I'd like to update the background color to be just a darker black color. And I'll also just make sure it has some space between our existing chart here. Make sure it lines up with it at the top and also the bottom. But to show you how we can create the option where we're displaying the hovered value and the clicked value, I'm just going to streamline the whole process and add in just a text element to begin with. I'll drag that out on our page. And I'll update this text to display the word last hovered point, semicolon. And I'll change the style of this to just be the H3 light style, which is just a default style from Bubble. I can then just reduce the height of that text element, move it into the corner of my group there. And now what I'd like to do below this is display, first of all, the year of the value that we're hovering over, as well as the product name and its revenue. So I'm going to copy this text element here. I'll drag that down, just move that across. And as I mentioned, the first thing I'll be displaying is the year. So I will insert dynamic data and I will choose from our dynamic multi-chart, which is the chart that we've just created here. And in this case, I'll be displaying its hover item X value. So if you remember, the X value is of course the year for this chart. I'll then open up our rich text editor and just select to bold all of that text. I'll save that. And now below this particular year value, I'll be displaying the product name that's being hovered as well as its revenue. So I will just once again copy this static text element here, drag that down, make sure it's in line. Then I can remove that static text, select to insert dynamic data. I'll be choosing from our dynamic multi-line chart. And in this case, I'll be displaying the product name. So this will be the hovered item series name, because of course the item series was the name of the Y value, which will either be product A, B, or C. So I'll select to display its name. Then I would like to add in a semicolon, and then I'll be displaying the value of the product that's currently being hovered. So I'll insert dynamic data again. I'll select from our dynamic multi-series chart. And in this case, I'll just be displaying the hovered item Y value, because the Y value is where we're storing the product revenue. And of course, I can format this as a currency. I'll add in our thousand separator and also set the currency to be dollars. Now, beside this, what I'd like to do is just replicate all of this text, only this time I'll just be displaying the value of the last item that's being clicked in this chart, not hovered. So I'm going to select all of our text elements here. I'm going to copy these across, and I'm going to start by selecting our static text option here and just remove the word hovered, and I'll be updating this with the word clicked. So it'll now display last clicked point. And now this is actually a pretty straightforward process to create. For the year that we're displaying, I'm just going to need to update, instead of displaying the hovered year, I'm just going to type in the word clicked, and I'll be displaying the clicked item X value. And then for the product name and also the dollar amount for that product, instead of displaying the hovered item series name, I'm going to type in the word clicked, and I'll just be displaying the clicked item series name. And then finally, for the Y value, instead of displaying the hovered Y value, I'm just going to display the clicked item Y value, and that will also format as a currency. Now, if we were to just go and preview what this experience looks like, we can take a look at how this feature functions within our Bubble development environment. So if I scroll on down to our chart, you'll see that there's no values currently being stored here. But if I was to hover over a value, it will update that dynamically, and it will continue to update based on the product and year that I hover over. And then if I was to click on a particular value, it will also store that in our group, and then I can continually compare that over any other values that I'd like to hover. And now that is a very basic version of how you can create this feature. As I'd shown you in my other bubble editor here, you can create whatever type of custom style of group you would like, and you can create hidden groups so it actually doesn't display a value when a user hasn't yet hovered or clicked on a particular point in your chart. But I just love the ability to actually create an event every time someone clicks a value. I think it's such a powerful feature that most chart plugins don't actually include. But from here, if I'm to jump back into my Notion doc, I can check off that we've finished adding in a way to store values when click events occur in a chart. The last two line charts that I'd like to walk us through are actually fairly straightforward. The first one I'll be showing you is a stepped line chart. And this is just a different style of line chart, which in my opinion replicates a similar design to a bar chart. So if we jump into our bubble editor, I'll show you how we can create this. In order to build this, I'm going to streamline the whole process and just copy across the dynamic single line bar chart that we had here. So if you remember, this is the bar chart where we were displaying the product revenues aggregated into every year. So in my bubble editor, I'm just going to copy the group that these sit within. I'll then drag this down on my page, move that down there. And then if I open up the chart, I'm not going to worry about changing the X or Y values. I'm happy at the moment as it's currently just searching for all of the unique years in my database, as well as also aggregating all of the product sales together by their year. The only change I'm going to update here is just the chart type. What I'd like to do is just select from the stepped line chart here, and you'll see that there's currently two options. There's the stepped before or stepped after option. Essentially what this does is it just allows you to identify where you would like the step function to occur within your chart, before or after a data point. What I'll do is I'll actually just show you how both look so you can get a good comparison for each option. So I'm going to start by selecting the stepped before option. I'll then just move this across a tad on our page, copy this whole group again. I'll move that across. I will open up this chart, and then I'll just be selecting that this option will be the step after stepped line chart. And now if I preview my bubble editor, we can scroll on down on the page and you'll see the two different style of stepped line charts here. So within the stepped before option, you just see that the line chart itself changes its direction before the value, whereas in the stepped after option, it changes the direction after a data point within the chart. And of course, you can create both single line or multi-series step line charts if you'd like. In my opinion though, I just find that step line charts look a little bit better with a single line chart. They can start to get a little messy if you're playing around with the multi-series option. But as I mentioned, I just love to be able to show you all of the options available with the Chart.JS plugin. If I just jump back into Notion though, I'm going to check off that we have ran through the process of creating and displaying a stepped line chart. As I mentioned, it's the exact same as creating any other line chart. The only differentiator is that you'll just need to update the type of chart itself to be a stepped line chart, not just a standard line chart. And from here, the last chart I'd like to show you how to create is an area chart, which if you're familiar with using bar charts, these are similar to the stacked bar chart option. And these are a personal favorite of mine as well. And they're also fairly straightforward to create. So if I jump into my bubble editor, to save us the time of having to create a new chart, what I'd like to do is just create an area chart displaying the dynamic values that we have stored for our product revenue by their years once again. And I'd like to display these as a multi-series option. So what I'm going to do is just create a new group and duplicate this exact chart across. So I'll jump into Bubble. I'll add a new group onto our page. We'll drag this out. I'll update the style of this to be group border, so that way it has a background color. And then what I like to do is just select on our multi-series dynamic chart here. I will copy that. I will then select our group and paste that in. And then from here, I'm just going to move that down and across, and then I can close off the height and width of that group there. And then finally, I'll just center that chart horizontally and also center that vertically. And now, once again, because I'm displaying a list of dynamic values of the product revenue for each year, I'm not going to need to make any changes to the X or Y values. But what I would like to do is just update the chart type here to be the stacked area chart, which is the line chart equivalent of a stacked bar chart. So I'll select that. And of course, if you'd like to update any of the data sources yourself, I'd always recommend pausing the tutorial right now and then updating any of the dynamic values that you'd like to display across either your X or Y values. But because I've copied this chart, I don't need to worry about that. So this is just going to be displaying the product revenue for each particular product by the corresponding year in our database. And of course, because I've copied the chart that I'd added before, I've also kept all of the same styling that I had previously added. So let's just jump ahead and preview our bubble editor. And now if I scroll on down on this page, what you'll see at the bottom here is a nice stacked area chart that just fills in all of the empty space between the values that we have stored. I think these are a great way, in my opinion, to just represent the true difference between each value that you have stored across your y-axis. But after adding in my stacked area chart, I'm going to jump back into Notion and just check off that I finished adding that in. And that is, of course, the last chart that I'd like to walk us through throughout this line chart tutorial. And that wraps up everything that I wanted to run throughout this tutorial today. As you can see, it's never been easier to create your own custom line chart that allows you to visualize data in any way you'd like using the Chart.JS plugin. As I mentioned at the beginning of our tutorial, there's plenty of other examples and documentation on the Chart.JS plugin page itself. So if you'd like to learn more, I'd always recommend checking that out. I'll be sure to put a link in the description below. But in the meantime, be sure to hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see more Bubble tutorials. And of course, I wish you all the best on your own no-code journey.